The air at Glenelg is already warm by mid-morning, with salt on the breeze and the soft grit of sand under bare feet. It is Sunday, the 26th of January, 1966, and Adelaide is moving through a bright holiday without hurry. In one ordinary family home, three children set out for the beach with the kind of confidence that once felt completely natural. Jane, Anna, and Grant Beaumont are old enough to seem briefly independent, old enough for a short trip that should end by early afternoon. Around them, the day unfolds in familiar places, the shoreline, the shops, the bus stops, all open to view and full of other people. Later, detectives would return to these simple locations again and again, as if patience alone might steady the edges of memory. They would study who saw the children, who thought they saw them, and how a crowded summer day could leave behind so little certainty. Because this case did not vanish into darkness, but into daylight, into routine, into the quiet gaps between one witness and the next. And if you settle here for a while, with the beach, the street, and the first missed bus home, the mystery begins in a very ordinary silence. The Beaumont children left from their home in Somerton Park, not far from the sea, on a route that had become familiar. Their mother, Nancy Beaumont, understood the trip as a small sign of growing independence, a beach outing measured in hours, not in risk. Jane, the eldest, was 9 years old. Anna was 7, Grant was 4. They were expected back in the early afternoon, in time for the shape of the day to continue as usual, with lunch, shade, and the ordinary return of children through a front gate. That expectation matters, because almost everything that follows begins with a routine that did not at first seem broken. The children traveled by bus to Glenelg, carrying a few coins, bathing things, and the kind of loose plan families trusted in those years. At the beach, the day was public. There were swimmers, sunbathers, shopkeepers, tram sounds, bus stops, the kiosk, jetty road, and the long, easy movement of a holiday crowd. Nothing about the setting suggested secrecy. Nothing about it suggested that three children could pass through so many eyes and still leave behind only fragments. By early afternoon, when the children did not come home on schedule, the first change in the day was small. It was not yet the shape of a case, it was a mother noticing time. Nancy Beaumont waited for the bus they should have taken, then she waited for the next one. The decision at first was simple and domestic. Wait a little longer, because buses could be missed, because children might linger, because summer afternoons often stretched. But when the second expected return passed, routine could no longer explain the delay. That was the first concrete escalation. Quiet, but unmistakable. A family expectation became a search. Nancy went looking locally. The beach itself was still close enough in the geography of the day to seem reachable by question and by hope. Jim Beaumont, the children's father, was away at the time on a work trip, and that absence added a particular stillness to the house. One parent was left to measure uncertainty alone, at least in those first hours. Relatives and neighbors joined in. They checked nearby places. They asked whether anyone had seen the children return, or seen them waiting for a bus, or walking home, or stopping somewhere harmless and explainable. Cause and effect moved quickly now. Because the children had not arrived when expected, the search remained local. Because the local search found nothing, the family had to widen its thinking. And because widening that thinking meant accepting that something was truly wrong, police were called. Once police entered the day, ordinary places changed character. The bus route was no longer just a route. It became a timeline. The beach was no longer just a public space. It became a field of witness memory. The shops and kiosks were no longer casual stops. They became possible anchors, places where someone might have noticed a gesture, a purchase, a face. Detectives began where anyone would begin, with the last places the children were known to have intended to be. That meant Glenelg Beach and the nearby shopping area. It also meant the difficult work of asking many people to remember one ordinary Sunday in the middle of summer when nothing at the time had seemed important enough to hold in perfect detail. Witnesses did come forward, Several remembered seeing the Beaumont children at or near the beach during the late morning and around midday. These were not hidden sightings in quiet lanes. They were public observations made in open daylight, and that fact shaped the case from the start. If the children had remained in plain view for much of the day, then something in their movements had not alarmed anyone nearby. That mattered. It suggested ease, or at least the appearance of ease. One witness recalled the children playing near the beach. Another placed them near the dressing rooms. Others remembered seeing them away from the sand, in the more built-up spaces around Glenelg, where beach life blended into shops and transport. Each account offered a point on the map. None by itself offered the whole route. Still, detectives needed a sequence, so they began trying to fix the children's movements in order, from arrival to time at the beach, to any errand into the nearby streets, to the bus home they never took. That is often how old cases begin to harden, not with certainty, but with the slow arrangement of partial memories. One early witness account stood out because it pushed the children beyond a simple beach visit. It suggested they had been seen near Jetty Road, the busy commercial strip close to the shore. That widened the field of inquiry immediately. If the children had moved back and forth between beach and shops, then there were more possible witnesses, but also more possible gaps. A crowded place can preserve and erase at the same time. People remember what seems unusual. On a holiday street, 3 children together did not seem unusual. Then another detail emerged, and it was more specific. A shopkeeper, or more precisely a woman working at a bakery, later reported that Jane Beaumont had bought food and had paid with a £1 note. That £1 note became one of the case's most discussed small facts because it did not fit what the family believed the children had taken with them. They were thought to have carried only a modest amount of money, enough for bus fare and perhaps small purchases, but not enough to explain that note. So police had to make a decision. Do they treat the bakery memory as mistaken, one more witness account softened by the passing of hours? Or do they treat it as meaningful evidence that the children had obtained money from someone else? That choice mattered because each path led to a different picture of the day. If the witness was mistaken, then the note meant little. If the witness was right, then the children may have had contact with an adult who had given them money, or paid for them, or was already moving beside them in a way that seemed natural enough not to alarm anyone. Detectives leaned toward taking the account seriously, not because it solved anything, but because small discrepancies can sometimes reveal the edges of a larger truth. The £1 note suggested an adult presence, or at least an unexplained change in the children's resources. And that, in turn, made other witness statements more important. Now investigators were listening differently. They were no longer asking only where the children had gone. They were asking who might have been with them. That shift brought another development. A number of witnesses described seeing the children in the company of a man. The descriptions were not identical, but they began to gather around a shared outline. He was said to be fair-haired, sun-tanned, and of a younger to middle adult age. He was dressed casually as one might expect at the beach, and he did not appear agitated, strange, or threatening. That last point is one of the quiet centers of this case. The reported adult did not stand out because of menace. He stood out later because the children seemed comfortable with him. One witness described the group in a way that suggested familiarity. Another remembered the children speaking with him as if they knew him or had quickly accepted him. For police, this was both useful and difficult. Useful because a companion was easier to search for than a blank space. Difficult because an adult who looked ordinary and behaved calmly could pass through a holiday crowd without leaving a sharp impression. Investigators now had to decide how central this unknown man should be. They could treat him as one possible lead among many, or they could place him at the center of the inquiry and ask the public to help identify him. The choice they made shaped the next phase of the case. Police treated the unidentified man as central. That caused the investigation to widen almost at once. Descriptions were circulated, appeals went out. People began to search their own memory of Glenelg that day for a fair-haired man with 3 children beside him. As always happens in a public case, the result was both hopeful and heavy. Tips came in. Names were suggested. Possible sightings multiplied. The pool of information grew larger, but not cleaner. Some callers were certain. Some were vague. Some likely remembered real things from the wrong day. Some may have folded newspaper descriptions into memory and believed, sincerely, that they had seen what was now being discussed everywhere. The very publicity needed to advance the case also complicated it. Every new description had the power to attract one useful lead and 10 mistaken ones. And yet the police could not ignore any of it, because too little was known and too much depended on one ordinary afternoon. Search efforts also expanded. This was no longer simply a question of whether the children had wandered or been delayed. As the hours passed into evening and evening into the first long night, the search became broad and systematic. Police and volunteers checked the beach. They checked nearby streets. They checked dunes, drains, buildings, reserves, places where children might hide, rest, get lost, or wait. Nothing gave them a confirmed trace. That absence had a consequence of its own. Because no immediate sign of the children was found in the expected search areas, investigators had to take more seriously the possibility that the children had left Glenelg in someone else's company. And if they had left with someone, then the unknown man moved from possibility toward priority. In the first days, witness statements were gathered in quantity. Each one had to be timed, compared, tested against bus schedules, family expectation, and the ordinary movement of the beach that day. What time had the children arrived? Who saw them first? Did they remain near the water, or were they moving inland earlier than first thought? Did the bakery purchase happen before noon, afternoon, or closer to the period when they should have begun returning home? Questions like these sound narrow, but they are the frame of the whole inquiry. If one sighting can be fixed firmly, it narrows the rest. If it cannot, the day stays wide. One especially important point was the missed bus. The children were known to have traveled independently before, and the return home had a recognizable rhythm. So investigators began working backward from the fact of that missed return. If the children did not board the expected bus, why not? Were they delayed by choice? Invited somewhere? Distracted by someone they trusted, or had been persuaded to trust? Or had the bus simply been missed in a way that led to confusion, wandering, and then further contact? Each explanation implied a different sequence. Police had to choose which possibilities deserved the most immediate energy. They could not prove abduction from the start, and they could not safely assume accident. So they worked both paths at once, searching physically while also building a human timeline from witnesses. That dual approach is methodical, but it can also be exhausting. One team follows roads and open ground. Another follows memory. And memory, even on a clear day, is often less stable than people hope. The family's own recollections became fixed points amid that uncertainty. The children had left dressed for the beach. They had not taken enough money, in the family's understanding, to account for larger spending. They had no reason to stay out into the late afternoon. They were not expected elsewhere. This mattered because it reduced the number of innocent explanations. The longer the children remained missing, the less likely it became that the day had simply drifted off course. A child who misses one bus may catch another. 3 children together, led by the eldest, usually create a pattern someone notices. But the more investigators learned, the more the case seemed to have unfolded in full public view, without creating the kind of single memorable moment that witnesses could later hold on to with certainty. That is one reason the Beaumont case has remained so haunting and so difficult. It asks how something can happen in daylight, among other people, and still leave only the soft outline of a story. By the end of the first critical stage, detectives had several firm realities and almost no firm conclusion. They knew the children had reached Glenelg. They knew the family expectation of return had been missed. They had witness accounts placing the children at the beach and near shops. They had a troubling report of Jane using a £1 note. and they had emerging descriptions of an unidentified man who seemed at ease with the children. Each detail pointed in the same direction, but not strongly enough to close the gap. So investigators had to continue outward. That meant more interviews, more comparisons, more patient sorting of people who had been in Glenelg that day, locals, visitors, workers, anyone whose movements might align with the children's last known path. The inquiry was already becoming larger than one afternoon. It was becoming a matter of elimination. One name after another would be considered, one account after another would be tested. And at the quiet center of that growing file was the simple fact that no one had stepped forward to say clearly and verifiably, yes, I was the man seen with those children, and this is why. That silence made the unknown figure more important with every passing day. It also made the witness descriptions more fragile, because the longer he remained unidentified, the more weight the case placed on memory alone. And so the next phase of the investigation moved from place to person. The beach was still there, the bakery was still there, Jetty Road was still there. But now detectives had to ask a harder question, not only where the Beaumont children were last seen, but who could stand beside them in plain sight, seem ordinary enough to pass without concern, and then disappear into the crowded brightness of Glenelg as if he had never been there at all. That question shaped almost every interview that followed, because once police accepted that the children may have been with an adult, every ordinary man seen near Glenelg that day became, briefly, someone to account for. The description that circulated was never as precise as detectives would have liked. It was useful enough to direct attention, but not sharp enough to isolate one person from a crowd. He was usually described as fair or light brown-haired, tanned, of medium build, and dressed in the easy way many men were dressed near the beach. There was no unusual coat, no striking scar, no vehicle number firmly attached to him in those first crucial days, just a face that seemed ordinary, and that very ordinariness was part of the problem. Witnesses tended to remember the children more clearly than the man. That made sense. 3 children together are a unit. An adult nearby can fade into the background, especially if he appears calm, and several witnesses suggested exactly that calm. The children did not seem frightened. They did not appear to be resisting. They did not create a scene that would have caused others to stop and look closely. That detail had an immediate consequence. If there was no outward sign of distress, then the moment in which the children were guided away, if they were guided away, may have passed through public space almost invisibly. Police had to work with the possibility that persuasion, familiarity, or the appearance of harmless authority had done what force in public daylight would likely have failed to do. That was difficult to accept, but it was methodical to consider. A crowded beach can protect people. It can also allow them to blend. And so the inquiry widened into the patient labor that cold case files often begin with, the checking of names, the tracing of movements, the asking of the same careful questions in slightly different rooms. Detectives spoke to people who worked near Jetty Road. They spoke to beachgoers. They spoke to bus staff. They spoke to shopkeepers, local residents, and anyone who might have seen the children move from one part of Glenelg to another. Each statement had to be weighed against time. That was harder than it sounds. Many people remember sequence better than clocks. They remember that something happened before lunch, or after a swim, or not long after church let out. But a case like this depends on the difference between late morning and early afternoon. A half hour can change the meaning of everything. So police began pinning witness memories to other fixed points. Bus schedules, shop opening times, work shifts, the heat of the day, whether a person had gone for ice cream before or after watching a surf display. These are humble details. Still, humble details are often what hold an investigation together. One of the reasons the Beaumont inquiry became so large, so quickly, was that Glenelg offered too many possible paths. The children could have remained near the beach. They could have moved inland along Jetty Road. They could have paused at the bakery, at other shops, or near the bus stop. They could have met someone there, or earlier. And every route introduced a fresh set of witnesses, each with different degrees of certainty. When detectives compared these accounts, they found both overlap and drift. Several statements supported the idea that the children were seen in company with the unknown man, but not all witnesses agreed on where or exactly when. This did not necessarily mean anyone was lying. It meant memory had to be handled gently. People may see the same group twice in different places and combine those moments later. They may notice children at one point and an adult at another, then join the images together after reading newspaper coverage. Police had to think about contamination long before the modern word for it became common in public discussion. Public appeals, though necessary, can shape recollection. That is one of the quiet paradoxes in a case like this. The more urgently police ask the public to remember, the more likely memory becomes mixed with suggestion. Still, there was no alternative. A man seen with 3 children in broad daylight in a public holiday setting had to be identified if possible. And because the witness accounts suggested ease rather than alarm, police also had to consider whether the man had known how to present himself in a reassuring way. That opened several possible lines of inquiry. He might have been someone the children had seen before, even casually. He might have been a stranger who spoke comfortably and confidently. He might have offered something small and ordinary: food, coins, help, a promise of seeing something interesting. Investigators could not know, but the bakery purchase kept returning them to one point. If Jane truly used a £1 note, then someone may have expanded the children's little world that day. Someone may have made them feel looked after. That possibility affected how detectives thought about suspects. They were not only looking for someone suspicious in the dramatic sense, they were looking for someone who could appear trusted within minutes. That moved the inquiry beyond the obvious. Local men were questioned. Visitors were traced where possible. Police looked at known offenders, of course, because any major missing child investigation does that. But they also had to examine men who did not fit the simple public image of danger. A case can go cold not only because there are too few names, but because there are too many names that could, in some narrow way, fit. That burden began to settle over the file early. Tips continued to arrive. Some came from people in Adelaide, others came from farther away. A reported sighting here, a remembered conversation there, a man who had left a boarding house suddenly, a stranger seen around children at another beach, an employee who had taken an unexplained day off, a traveler who had seemed too interested in local routines. Any one of these could sound meaningful in isolation. Placed together, they created a dense and often contradictory map. Detectives had to sort the merely possible from the genuinely useful. That sorting process rarely feels dramatic. It is mostly elimination. You take a name, you check where he lived, you ask where he was on the 26th of January, you ask whether anyone can confirm it. You compare his age, his appearance, his employment, his vehicle, if he had one, his access to the area, his habits. Then you move to the next name, and the next, and the next. In the early stages, police also faced another practical problem. Not every witness came forward at once. Some people only recognized the significance of what they had seen after hearing more about the case. Others were uncertain and hesitated, not wanting to waste police time. Still others may have assumed their small observation did not matter, but old investigations are often built from delayed fragments. A person who saw children laughing with an adult may not think to mention it until they realize those children never came home. By then, hours have passed, sometimes days, and each passing hour softens edges. This is one way a case slips away from certainty, not through a single failure, but through the normal delay between event and meaning. The police response in South Australia was extensive for the time. Searches expanded, officers checked likely areas again and again, public notices were issued, photographs of the children circulated widely. The city, and then the country, began to absorb the fact that this was no longer a local family emergency. It was becoming a national mystery. That brought attention, which brought leads, which brought pressure. And pressure changes investigations. It can help resources flow faster. It can also make every decision feel heavier. When the public begins to focus on one figure, In this case, the unknown man, police are pushed toward resolution through identification. Who was he? Why had no one named him? Why had he not come forward if he were innocent and had simply shared some harmless moment with the children? Those were fair questions. But fair questions are not the same as evidence. Detectives still had to hold to standards. A vague resemblance was not enough. A rumor from a neighbor was not enough. Even a confident witness identification, if made after publicity and delay, had to be treated carefully. This is the slow side of investigation. It can appear hesitant from the outside. Inside a case file, it is often the only defense against building a false story. As the days became weeks, the search for the man broadened beyond Glenelg. Police considered whether he might not be local at all. A holiday area attracts movement. People come in from other suburbs. They travel from country districts. They arrive by car, tram, bus, or on foot. Seasonal workers move through. Visitors rent rooms. Someone could appear at the beach one day and vanish from Adelaide the next without attracting much notice. That possibility widened the case further. Now investigators had to think in terms of jurisdictions, records, and patterns that were not neatly bounded by one neighborhood. Descriptions were sent out. Men of similar appearance were checked. Known offenders from other places were considered. Travelers passing through South Australia came under attention where there was any reason at all to look closer. This expansion, though necessary, came with a cost. The larger the net, the more information pours in. And information is only useful if it can be sorted, tested, and linked. Many old investigations become archives of unresolved possibility. The Beaumont case was already becoming one. There were moments when police thought they might be close to something firm. A witness would seem strong. A suspect would resemble the descriptions. A detail would line up in a way that felt promising. Then an alibi would hold, or the timeline would fail, or the identification would weaken when tested. That repeated pattern, promise, scrutiny, collapse, is one of the reasons long investigations become so exhausting for everyone involved. From a distance, the public sees only names entering and leaving the news. Inside the inquiry, detectives are living with uncertainty all day, every day. And all the while there is the family. Nancy and Jim Beaumont were not living inside an abstract investigation. They were living inside absence. Appeals were made, photographs were shared. The family's hopes had to rise whenever a lead sounded plausible, then settle again when it faded. The human cost of repeated false movement is easy to overlook in cold case summaries, but every lead has emotional weight. Every reported sighting asks a family to imagine briefly that this may be the one. Then the phone call changes again. No, not that person. No, not that car. No, not that location. That cycle began early and did not truly stop. Because the witness reports indicated that the children seemed at ease. Police also had to ask whether the unknown man had approached them through conversation earlier in the day. Perhaps he had spoken to them at the beach before being noticed more clearly later. Perhaps the contact developed gradually. A short exchange, then another, then food, then a walk. That kind of progression would explain why no sharp moment of alarm was remembered. It would also explain why descriptions of the man remained so frustratingly calm. Nothing in them suggested haste. Nothing in them suggested a struggle. Just a man who did not appear out of place. That is one of the cruel efficiencies of a public setting. A stranger, who knows how to seem ordinary, can move in plain sight more easily than anyone wants to believe. The police were aware of that. But awareness does not create proof. Proof requires something fixed. A name, a home address, a vehicle, a physical item tied to one person. The investigation, at least in the form visible to the public, had none of these. And the lack of physical evidence would become more important with time. There was no modern surveillance to review, no quiet network of cameras preserving the day in fragments, no digital tickets, no mobile phone location histories, no bank traces from a stranger's afternoon. The case depended heavily on what people had seen, what they thought they had seen, and what they could still recall after the fact. That did not make the evidence worthless. It made it delicate. The difference matters. A witness may be honest and still uncertain. A witness may be detailed and still mistaken. A witness may remember the feeling of a moment better than its exact content. Police knew this, so they kept comparing statements, not only for agreement but for independent points of contact. Who mentioned the man before hearing others do so? Who described him in a way that matched without simply echoing newspaper language? Who could place the children in a verifiable location near a specific time? This is detective work at its most patient, not dramatic but exacting. And in the Beaumont case, patience did not quickly produce clarity. Instead, it produced volume. The file grew. The public interest deepened. The sense that the answer might lie in one ordinary-looking adult became stronger. But strong suspicion spread thinly over many possibilities can leave a case strangely weightless. There is movement. There is effort. There is no landing place. As weeks turned into months, the search for suspects took on a broader shape. Men reported by neighbors were interviewed. Some volunteered themselves after recognizing they fit parts of the description and wanting to clear their names. Others came under attention because of jobs that brought them near beaches, bus routes, or children. Drivers, laborers, shop workers, itinerant workers, men living alone, men recently arrived, men recently gone. Each category was looked at because there was no luxury of ignoring any plausible avenue. Investigators also revisited the practical spaces around Glenelg, roads leading away, quiet industrial areas, places where someone might pause unnoticed. The search of nearby terrain had already produced no confirmed trace, and that lack of discovery itself influenced police reasoning. If the children had remained close by, perhaps something would have been found quickly. Because nothing was found, the hypothesis that they had been moved gained strength. That, in turn, fed renewed focus on vehicles. Had a car been seen? Did any witness remember the children getting into one? Did anyone see a man with them near a parking area? Again, answers were partial. Some reports suggested vehicles, others did not. No single account settled the point firmly, and so another branch of inquiry remained open without closing. You can feel, in cases like this, how a file thickens. One page says fair-haired man, another says light brown, one says late 20s, another says perhaps older, one says near the beach, another says near a shop. One remembers food, another remembers conversation. Each page matters. No single page is enough. At some point, the burden of decision falls on detectives in a very quiet way. How much effort do you spend pursuing a line supported by multiple soft statements? How much effort do you reserve for hard evidence that may never come? This is not indecision, it is allocation. And in 1966, without modern forensic pathways, witness memory had to carry more of the structure than it would in a later era. That is one reason the case is often revisited as a study in limitation as well as loss. Police did not fail to care. They were working within the tools and the assumptions available. That distinction matters. At the time, routine child independence was more common. A group of children on buses and at a beach did not trigger attention. An adult speaking to them might not either. By the time those ordinary scenes were reinterpreted as the last visible moments of the children, the opportunity to observe had already passed. The city itself changed under the pressure of the case. Parents paid more attention to small freedoms that had once seemed harmless. Public spaces were still public spaces, but they no longer felt quite the same. The Beaumont disappearance became one of those events that divide memory into before and after. Before, children could be sent off with coins and a return time. After, that trust became harder. But inside the investigation, there was no room yet for cultural meaning. There were still too many practical questions. Among the many names and theories that surfaced over time, some became public favorites. That often happens when a case remains unresolved. The unknown man in the abstract is difficult for people to live with. A named suspect, even a weakly supported one, feels more manageable. It gives shape to uncertainty. Yet shape can be misleading. Detectives had to guard against that. A suspect can look compelling because he fits the emotional need for an answer. The actual case against him may be thin, and the Beaumont inquiry would return to this problem again and again over the years. One early and lasting challenge was identification from memory. When witnesses are asked to help describe a stranger after the fact, they often remember the general impression first: height, coloring, age range, manner. The face itself can be less stable. A lineup or photograph comparison may produce confidence, but confidence is not always reliability. Police understood this in practice, even if the language around eyewitness science was less developed than it is now. So, whenever a man drew attention, investigators had to ask not only whether he looked right, but whether the process leading to identification had been clean. Had the witness seen his picture in the paper already? Had his name been discussed publicly? Had rumor preceded formal questioning? All of those things could weaken what looked strong on the surface. Meanwhile, searches in physical spaces continued at intervals. Areas around Glenelg were examined. More distant locations were considered when leads pointed there. None produced confirmation. That repeated absence changed the emotional weather of the case. In the beginning, there is often hope that searching the nearby world will solve the problem. A child is lost, delayed, hidden, helped by someone. Time passes, and the search becomes broader, then broader still. Eventually, the file itself becomes the main place where the case exists, in statements, maps, reports, names, and unanswered comparisons. The Beaumont case was entering that stage. Still, detectives could not let it simply become paper. They continued interviewing. They revisited witnesses. They looked for inconsistency. Not because inconsistency always means deceit, but because it can reveal where memory is weakest. Sometimes what changes between statements tells you as much as what stays the same. A witness may alter a time but keep the same location. Another may keep the time but soften the appearance of the man. Those patterns can help investigators decide what part of an account may be trusted most. This is slow and often thankless work. Yet it is often the only way to keep an old mystery honest. The unknown man remained at the center because no better center ever appeared. That fact shaped public imagination for decades. He was not identified with confidence. He was not eliminated. He was simply there, in statement after statement, as a possibility too important to ignore and too vague to resolve. That is the kind of figure who haunts case files. Not dramatic in his outline, just persistent. As the investigation moved out of its first stage, police had to manage a difficult balance. They needed public help. They also needed to prevent the case from dissolving into rumor. Every new tip had to be entered, considered, and ranked. Every interview had to be compared against the growing body of material. And because there were 3 children, not one, many people assumed someone somewhere must have noticed something decisive. That assumption makes emotional sense. In practice, crowds are less observant than we imagine. Each person sees a fragment. Few know, in the moment, which fragment matters. So the case moved into its next long rhythm. Searches with no trace, suspects with no proof, leads that glowed briefly and then dimmed. The beaches and roads of that January day remained unchanged on the map, but inside the file, they became dense with possibility. Police checked drainage areas, sandhills, nearby structures, and open land. They followed reports into surrounding districts. They examined whether any isolated property, vacant building, or neglected corner might have some connection. These efforts were broad because they had to be. With no confirmed final location, almost any place accessible from Glenelg had to be considered. The physical search, however, kept returning the same answer. Nothing definite. No confirmed belongings. No location that could close the day. That lack of physical trace gave witness evidence even more importance than before. And that, in turn, made the investigation more vulnerable to error. The more a case depends on memory, the more every remembered detail must bear. A bus seen leaving, a conversation overheard, a man helping children cross a street. a food purchase, a laugh, a casual gesture. And because each fragment had to carry so much, every fragment also had the power to mislead. Police soon found themselves in the most familiar posture of a long unsolved case, moving constantly, while getting nowhere firm. A name would surface from a neighborhood rumor, then fade after inquiry. A witness would sound certain, then become less certain when asked for time, distance, and sequence. A place would seem worth searching, then offer only more ground, more emptiness, more notes in the file. This is often how a case grows cold in real life, not with one dramatic failure, but with the steady accumulation of uncertainty. The Beaumont investigation continued to expand through South Australia, and then beyond it, because once the possibility of an unknown adult leaving Glenelg with the children was taken seriously, the case was no longer confined to the beach. Officers had to consider roads out of Adelaide, rail routes, temporary lodgings, work camps, boarding houses, motels, sheds, vacant blocks, and all the quiet, practical spaces that investigators examine when certainty is absent. That widening produced one immediate consequence. The more broadly police searched, the more they had to rely on systems of paperwork that were slower and less connected than they would be now. Files had to be requested, names had to be checked by hand, information had to move across desks, stations, and jurisdictions through ordinary channels. A modern listener can easily underestimate what that meant. Today, a single query can gather scattered details in moments. In 1966, much of that labor was physical. Cards, notes, type reports, phone calls, letters, people walking paper from one office to another. So while the public imagined a single great search, the actual work was made of many smaller motions. An officer interviewing a shopkeeper again, another checking the hours of a bus route, another tracing a man who had recently changed address, another reading older reports on known offenders, another comparing witness descriptions that seemed close but not quite close enough. The shape of the inquiry became administrative as well as emotional. That matters because cold cases often harden inside bureaucracy. Not because bureaucracy is careless, but because it is the structure through which uncertain information must pass. And uncertain information, when multiplied thousands of times, becomes difficult to hold clearly in one mind. One of the things that made the Beaumont case especially difficult was that the children had not vanished from a single fixed point. There was no one doorway, one lane, one clear last sighting, one exact minute everyone agreed on. Instead, there was movement. Beach to shop, shop to street, street to bus area perhaps, public place to public place. That made the inquiry feel almost fluid. And fluid cases are harder to contain. If the children had remained near the shore all day, that would be one pattern. If they had moved inland with someone, that was another. If the key moment happened near Jetty Road, police needed one kind of witness. If it happened near transport, they needed another. If a vehicle was involved, they needed still another set of eyes. No single version could be accepted too early. At the same time, police had to make practical choices about whom to interview first, and most deeply. That meant local men whose appearance generally matched the public description. It also meant men reported to have shown interest in children, men known to spend time around the beach, men connected to vehicles seen nearby, men who had recently behaved strangely, and men whose own routines on that Sunday could not be easily accounted for. Some of these inquiries were naturally discreet, others became known more widely, and the moment a name entered public discussion, the case changed a little. Once the public begins attaching possibility to specific people, rumor starts doing its own investigative work. Rumor is fast, it is also unreliable. Police had to protect the case from it, even while they depended on public attention to produce leads. That balance is difficult in any era. In a case involving children, it becomes even harder. A recurring problem in the Beaumont file was that many men could, at first glance, seem to fit. Sun-tanned, fair-haired or light brown-haired, average build, presentable, ordinary beach clothing. Nothing in that description was rare in Adelaide in January. A man could resemble the outline and still be entirely unrelated. That is why resemblance alone was never enough. Detectives needed a connection, a reason the person would have been in Glenelg, a path that placed him there, a weakness in his account, a corroborating witness, a physical clue, some little hinge on which the larger door might turn. Often they did not get one, and when they did, it was often not strong enough to hold. The investigation also had to absorb false confessions and attention-seeking behavior, because old famous cases nearly always attract them. Not every person who inserts himself into a case is malicious. Some are troubled. Some crave importance. Some convince themselves that scraps of dream, memory, and newspaper language are real involvement. Police had to spend time sorting these as well. Time spent sorting one kind of false lead is time not spent elsewhere. That is not criticism. It is simply the arithmetic of investigative work. The longer a case remains visible, the more of this arithmetic it must endure. There were also men whose histories made them worth examining more than once. In a file this large, police do return. A suspect is interviewed, then revisited years later when a witness remembers something new, or when another piece of information makes an old name seem slightly more interesting. The Beaumont case would become known for exactly that pattern. Names never fully disappear. They settle into the archive and wait. Then some later detective takes one out again, lays the old pages flat, and asks whether the earlier officers missed something, or whether the age of the case has simply made every unresolved line look important. At the same time, public pressure did not fade as quickly as it does in many other missing person cases. The disappearance of 3 children together on a holiday afternoon in a public place was too unusual and too painful to recede quietly. South Australia did not stop thinking about it. Neither did the press. That attention kept the case alive, but it also preserved every uncertainty. When police were seen to be searching a place, people asked why. When a man was questioned, people wondered whether this was at last the answer. When nothing came of it, disappointment spread and hardened. This rise and fall of expectation can shape a case from the outside in. It creates demand for progress. Progress, in turn, can look like motion even when evidence has not improved. Detectives had to resist the temptation to give shape to a theory simply because the public needed one. That restraint may feel unsatisfying, but it is one of the marks of patient investigation. As the file thickened, the absence of forensic evidence became more punishing. There were no ordinary modern pathways to follow. No broad DNA screening, no network of security cameras, no automatic records tracing a stranger across a city. No easy way to test a witness claim against preserved visual evidence. If someone said they saw the children at a shop, police had to work with that statement on its own merits. If another witness disagreed, the disagreement had to be reasoned through, not technologically resolved. This gave old-fashioned detective skills unusual weight. Interviewing, comparison, elimination, re-interviewing. Understanding local routine. Knowing when a witness was sincere, when they were uncertain, and when they might be unconsciously building memory after the fact. These are quiet skills. They rarely produce dramatic moments, but in the Beaumont case, they were almost the entire method. There is also the difficult matter of how children are perceived in public space. The witness account suggesting the children appeared relaxed created one of the investigation's deepest obstacles. If bystanders saw 3 children with an adult and felt no alarm, then the decisive moment may have looked harmless. A child taking food from an adult can look innocent. A child talking to a stranger can look like ordinary beach sociability. A group crossing a road together may look like assistance. No one stops a scene that does not yet look like a problem. By the time it is known to have been a problem, the scene is gone. That is one reason the case had such a strong effect on public life afterward. It taught people that danger, if it was danger, need not look dramatic. But that lesson came later. At the time, police were left trying to reconstruct a day made of normal gestures, and so the search went on. Large areas around Adelaide were considered. Sites suggested by tipsters were examined. Men whose names arose repeatedly were looked at from multiple angles. Employment records were checked where possible. Residential patterns were compared. Witnesses were asked to view photographs. Old assumptions were tested against new statements. The result, again and again, was not resolution but narrowing. Some names could be ruled out, some could not. Some remained possible only because nothing strong enough existed to exclude them. That category, not cleared, not proved, can dominate a cold case. It creates a long corridor of half-open doors. The file becomes a place of suspended judgment. Among the names that later drew significant attention was a wealthy local businessman, Harry Phipps. Though this line of inquiry would mature much later and under very different circumstances than the first urgent phase of the case. At the time of the disappearance itself, police were dealing with a much wider field. Phipps did not arrive as an early definitive suspect in the public imagination of 1966. Rather, his name would gather importance over the decades, especially as later investigators and journalists revisited old accounts, old properties, and old statements. It is worth moving slowly here, because this is where many retellings become too eager. The Beaumont case did not hinge on one suspect from the beginning. It wandered through many possibilities before certain figures drew sustained attention. That wandering matters. It is part of why the case went cold. A cold case is often a case that never found a stable center. Instead, it kept circling. For the family, the practical burden of that circling was immense. Nancy and Jim Beaumont had to live not only with uncertainty, but with repeated contact from police, reporters, and members of the public. Each anniversary revived attention. Each promising lead asked them, in effect, to reopen the day. People often think of unresolved cases as suspended in time. In one sense they are, but the people inside them do not stop living. Years pass, routines continue, faces age, homes change. But one day at Glenelg remains fixed, while everything around it moves. This contrast can be hard to hold. Investigators, too, age through a file. The officer who first took a statement may later retire. The detective who revisited a witness in the 1970s may hand the file to someone younger in the 1980s. Knowledge that once lived in memory has to be translated into notes. What did that witness seem like in person? How confident was the identification really? Did the suspect answer too smoothly or simply calmly? These things are not always fully captured on paper, so a cold case can lose texture even while it keeps its facts. That is one reason reopenings matter so much. A later team may not know what an earlier team felt about a line of inquiry, unless they are told. And even then they inherit only part of it. As the case crossed from immediate emergency into long-term investigation, South Australian police had to decide how much of their effort should remain visible. Visible action reassures the public, but it can also reveal too much. Quiet work protects the file, but it can appear to be inaction. This tension is common in major unsolved cases. A search might be underway without public explanation. A suspect might be under review without public naming. A witness may be re-interviewed privately years after everyone assumes that line is dead. The Beaumont inquiry contained all of these rhythms at different times. Publicly, however, what many people saw was a simpler pattern. Search, appeal, hope, no answer. Another name, another theory, no answer. This repetition can alter how a case is remembered. It begins as a disappearance. It becomes a mystery. Then it becomes almost a vessel into which each generation pours its own theories. That happened here. Still, beneath all the theory, the practical reason the case remained open was plain enough. No one had been identified with evidence strong enough to explain what happened to Jane, Anna, and Grant. And because that central fact never changed, the file retained a kind of gravity. It kept drawing people back. Through the later 1960s and into the years that followed, officers continued to review reports involving child-related offenses, suspicious behavior, and itinerant men whose movements had crossed Adelaide at relevant times. This was not glamorous work, it was comparative work. If a man had been accused elsewhere, could he have been in South Australia in January of 1966? If he had a vehicle, what kind? If he had lived near the coast, was there any witness who had mentioned him? If he had used aliases, could those aliases tie to addresses already in the file? One by one, these checks were made. In many instances, they led nowhere. But nowhere in detective work is still a result. It closes a little space. Sometimes that little space matters later. One of the frustrations in the Beaumont case was that several theories were difficult to disprove completely. An unidentified man seen with the children could, in principle, have been local. He could also have been passing through. He could have acted alone. He could have had access to a property. He could have used a vehicle. He could have been someone who had approached the children earlier that morning. These were not wild possibilities. They were reasonable investigative options. Yet because so little hard evidence pinned any one of them down, police could not confidently rank one final scenario above the others. That is what a cold case often is at its core. Not one mystery, but several plausible stories competing for a proof that never comes. There was another subtle challenge. The very familiarity of Glenelg worked against the case. People who visit a familiar place do not observe it like strangers. They move through it by habit. They assume safety. They notice what interrupts routine, not what fits within it. For the Beaumont children, Glenelg was not some distant unknown shore. It was within the geography of ordinary life. That made their movements less remarkable to onlookers. And because the day was a holiday, the public setting was even more full of motion than usual. A crowded place can produce more witnesses. It can also dilute attention. Each person believes someone else would notice if anything were wrong. No one realizes in the moment that everyone is thinking the same thing. As later years arrived, the investigation entered what might be called the archive period. This does not mean activity stopped. It means activity changed form. The first phase of a case is built around searching the world. The archive phase is built around searching prior effort. Detectives begin rereading old statements, checking whether a witness who was once vague might now be clearer, or whether a suspect dismissed early deserves another look. They ask whether assumptions made under the pressure of the first days were sound. They ask whether a detail that seemed minor then now appears central. In the Beaumont case, this archive phase would last for decades, and with each return the same uncomfortable truth remained. The case file was rich in material, but poor in closure. There were enough details to keep hope alive. There were not enough to end the search. By the 1970s, the case had become part of Australia's larger social memory. People who had not been at Glenelg that day still knew the names. The disappearance was now discussed not only as a police matter, but as a cultural event, something that had changed how childhood freedom was understood. That broad recognition had two effects on the investigation. First, it ensured that tips never fully stopped. Second, it made the case vulnerable to mythology. When a mystery becomes famous, each retelling can smooth rough edges, sharpen uncertain details, and create a version of events more orderly than the original evidence allows. Detectives returning to such a case must often separate the documented file from the story the public has come to believe. That is harder than it sounds. The public story can influence witnesses too. A person who has heard the same summary for years may begin to remember the summary instead of the event. This is one reason later interviews in old cases are handled carefully. Investigators are not just asking what happened. They are asking what part of the memory is original and what part has been layered over time. Some of the Beaumont witness evidence proved especially sensitive in this way. Descriptions of the unknown man, for instance, often carried a consistent core impression, but less certainty at the edges. That core impression remained useful. The edges did not always. Still, because there was no better route, police had to keep returning to it. The case also generated private investigations, journalistic theories, and amateur research, some sincere and some less careful. This too is common in major unsolved cases. Public fascination creates parallel inquiries. Sometimes these uncover overlooked material. Sometimes they produce confusion. Sometimes they fix attention on one suspect so strongly that every other possibility seems to disappear from view. The Beaumont file would eventually absorb all of this. Official police review had to continue alongside a changing landscape of outside speculation. If you imagine the case as a box of documents, the box does not remain neatly sealed. Over time, more papers are pushed in, more claims, more letters, more remembered details, more suggested names. The archive grows heavier, and with that weight comes a strange kind of difficulty. A detective reopening the case is not beginning from nothing. He is beginning from too much. That is different, but no easier. It requires selection. What should be trusted? What should be tested? What has already been tested and should not be repeated without reason? What was ignored because of the limitations of the time? What should now be reconsidered because methods have changed? Those questions belong to the next long life of the case, the decades of reopening. And in the Beaumont matter, reopening was not occasional in the casual sense. It became part of the case's identity. The file did not simply survive, it persisted. Officers in later years looked again at witness inconsistencies. They reconsidered known offenders. They reviewed geographical possibilities. They examined whether old searches had missed certain sites. And as broader forensic thinking changed in criminal investigation, the case acquired a new kind of hope. Not fresh evidence in the ordinary sense, but the possibility that old assumptions might be revisited with different tools and different patience. One of the most telling signs that a case still matters institutionally is the willingness to spend time and money on it long after the first wave of attention has passed. The Beaumont case received that attention repeatedly. This was not only because of public memory, it was because police themselves understood that the disappearance remained one of South Australia's defining unanswered investigations. That status kept the file from resting quietly. Years later, specific locations came under renewed scrutiny. Properties linked, however tenuously, to persons of interest were discussed, reviewed, and in some cases physically searched. These searches often drew public notice because they suggested movement, perhaps this time, perhaps at last. But from an investigative standpoint, a renewed search usually begins much more modestly. A statement is reread, a property timeline is clarified, a person once thought irrelevant is linked, however slightly, to a key area. A witness says something that fits an older suspicion. Then detectives ask whether the place should be examined. That is cause and effect in a cold case, not revelation. Accumulation. One of the most discussed later episodes involved excavation at a site connected to Harry Phipps, whose former factory area at North Plympton became the focus of renewed attention decades after the children disappeared. The reason for this interest was not a single clear piece of proof, but a cluster of claims and suspicions that gathered around him over time. Phipps was a local businessman. He had means. He had access to property. And according to later accounts, including those from people who knew or worked around him, he had a reputation that caused investigators and journalists to look at him seriously. It is important, again, to remain patient here. Suspicion is not solution. What later drew investigators back to him was the way several older fragments seemed, at least on paper, to lean in the same direction. A former employee and others who had known the area described children being seen near the factory grounds in years before the renewed searches. Those accounts did not prove anything by themselves, but they gave detectives a reason to ask whether an old property once passed over or never fully examined might still matter. That question led to one of the most visible cold case developments in the Beaumont investigation. Decades after the disappearance, excavations were carried out at the North Plympton site. Heavy equipment arrived. So did reporters, photographers, and the familiar public feeling that perhaps the long stillness of the file had shifted. From a distance, an excavation can look like certainty. In truth, it often begins in uncertainty. Investigators had to decide whether a combination of rumor, recollection, and historical association justified disturbing the ground. Choosing to search meant spending public money, accepting scrutiny, and risking another disappointment in a case already full of them. Still, they chose to proceed. That choice revealed something important about the Beaumont file. It had never become merely symbolic. It was still being treated as a live problem, one worthy of practical action. When the digging began, many people watched as if the earth itself might answer what witnesses and suspects had not. But the ground, like the file, did not give up a resolution. Nothing found there settled the case. That outcome mattered in two ways. First, it removed one hoped-for path to closure. Second, it showed how difficult cold case work can be, even when authorities are willing to act boldly. An excavation is not hesitation, it is commitment. And yet, commitment can still end in silence. The Phipps line, then, became a good example of how the Beaumont case evolved across time. A suspect theory could gather force. A site could be searched. Public expectation could rise. And still, the central questions would remain. For detectives, that meant returning once again to the older foundations of the case. Witnesses, timelines, movements, the unknown man, the £1 note, the public setting, the missed bus. Everything that had been there from the beginning remained there still. This is often what reopening a file teaches. Not that the old work was useless, but that the old problems were real. A later search cannot repair an evidentiary gap created on the first day. A new suspect theory cannot by itself sharpen a witness memory formed in 1966. Time adds perspective. It does not always add proof. So the years of reopening became less about expecting one dramatic breakthrough and more about testing one by one whether any old uncertainty could be made less uncertain. Police revisited statements for inconsistency. They looked again at how the children's route had been reconstructed. They reconsidered whether the key assumption of willing companionship with the unknown man was still the strongest reading. They examined whether some witnesses had been given too much weight and others too little. That kind of review can feel almost philosophical. You are not only asking what happened, you are asking how earlier investigators decided what likely happened, and whether those decisions were shaped by the limitations of the moment. For example, the report of Jane using a £1 note remained important because it touched several parts of the case at once. If true, it suggested outside money. If outside money, then likely adult contact. If adult contact, then perhaps the unknown man was not incidental at all, but active in guiding the afternoon. Yet even here, caution remained necessary. A shop assistant can remember the amount paid incorrectly. A child can produce more money than expected for innocent reasons. A witness may merge one customer's purchase with another's. So every path returned to the same problem. The details were meaningful but not decisive. That made later investigators careful in a very specific way. They could not simply collect old statements and count them. They had to rank them. Which memories were given early, before publicity spread, which were made after news coverage, which contained specific verifiable anchors, which were broad impressions, which had changed over time. This kind of ranking is quiet work. It rarely produces dramatic headlines, but it is how a cold case unit tries to reduce noise. And the Beaumont file contained a great deal of noise. One person might remember the children being calm, another would remember them cheerful. A third might place them slightly later in the day. A fourth would describe the man as younger, or older, or taller, or more neatly dressed. No one difference destroyed the usefulness of the evidence, but together they made certainty hard to build. In later years, detectives also had the advantage of hindsight about witness reliability. Modern thinking around memory had become more developed. Investigators better understood how suggestion, repetition, and publicity can shape recollection. So when they reopened the Beaumont case, they were not simply reusing old statements. They were reassessing the conditions under which those statements had been made. That did not solve the case. It did, however, sharpen the understanding of why it had gone cold. The public often imagines cold cases as waiting for one overlooked clue. Sometimes that happens. More often, the truth is less tidy. A case goes cold because the available evidence was never strong enough to survive time without eroding. The Beaumont investigation had early energy, national attention, extensive searching, and decades of review. What it lacked was a piece of evidence sturdy enough to anchor everything else. No one object could do that. No one witness could do that. No one suspect could do that. Even the strongest lines of inquiry eventually ran into the same barrier. They suggested, they did not conclude. It is also worth remembering how much of the investigation depended on assumptions about normality. The children had traveled to Glenelg before. A beach trip was not extraordinary. Children moving between sand, shops, and buses was not extraordinary. An adult talking casually with children in a public place might not seem extraordinary either. Because each part of the afternoon fit familiar patterns, the whole event was able to pass without immediate resistance. That shaped the file forever. If there had been one unusual act, one public disturbance, one memorable confrontation, one distinct vehicle noted by several people, the case might have held together differently. Instead, the event was built from things that seemed ordinary until later, and later is always harder. Police in 1966 were also working without ordinary surveillance. This point is often made, but it deserves to be felt rather than merely stated. Today, investigators reviewing a beach district disappearance might have footage from shops, traffic intersections, buses, nearby businesses, and private homes. They might trace transactions. They might compare digital records. They might map movement minute by minute. At Glenelg in 1966, none of that existed in practical form. A public place was public, but not recorded. Once the day passed, it survived only in human memory. That is a very fragile container for truth. The case also crossed the difficult boundary between local familiarity and wider mobility. If the unknown man was local, perhaps someone should have recognized him. If he was not local, recognition became much less likely. That split complicated every appeal. Police had to speak to the community as if the answer might be nearby. At the same time, they had to investigate as if the answer might have passed briefly through Adelaide and then gone elsewhere. Those are different tasks. One asks neighbors to think, the other asks institutions to compare records across distance. Both consume time, both create paperwork, and neither guarantees a result. When later teams reopened the file, they inherited not just facts, but choices made under pressure. Why had one suspect been discounted? Why had another been pursued? Why had a witness been treated as reliable or not? Sometimes the original reasoning was clear in reports. Sometimes it was less clear. This is another quiet way a case cools. The people closest to the beginning leave. Their judgments remain, but not always their full reasoning. A cold case team must then decide whether to trust earlier discretion or start again from first principles. In the Beaumont matter, some lines were indeed started again. Old names were re-examined, old locations were revisited, old assumptions were tested against new standards. That process did not reveal a hidden simple answer. What it revealed, again and again, was complexity. There had been many possible pathways from Glenelg that day, too many perhaps for the evidence available. Another factor in the case's long life was public memory itself. Because the Beaumont children became so widely known in Australia, the case never fully left the national imagination. That had one useful effect. People continued to come forward even years later with possible recollections. It also had one harmful effect. The case became surrounded by a haze of retelling, and retelling can smooth away uncertainty. A witness once described as tentative can become, in public memory, definitive. A suspect once described as interesting can become, in popular discussion, almost established. Cold case investigators have to keep returning to the original language, not what people later said the witness had said, not what a summary implied. The words on the page, the date of the statement, the context. This kind of discipline is not dramatic, but it is one of the only protections against myth. The Beaumont file required that discipline because so many theories accumulated around it. Some focused on local offenders, some on itinerant men, some on specific businessmen, some on long-shot sightings in other states, some on sites searched years later. Each theory had its own pattern of internal logic, yet police could not let logic replace evidence. That was the repeated decision. Pursue, but verify. Consider, but do not leap. Search, but understand that a search is not proof of guilt. Interview, but understand that a witness who sounds honest may still be wrong. The result of such caution can be frustrating to the public. It can look like drift, but drift and restraint are not the same thing. The Beaumont case contains both. There was drift because the evidence did not settle. There was restraint because police could not responsibly force an answer out of uncertainty. As the decades passed, developments in forensic science naturally raised hopes. Around the world, old cases were being revisited with improved methods. Latent evidence, where preserved, could sometimes be re-examined. Physical items once considered unhelpful could become meaningful. Patterns across cases could be compared more effectively. All of this created a new atmosphere around famous unsolved investigations. Maybe time itself had become useful. Maybe old limitations could be overcome. But such hope depends on what survives. And in the Beaumont case, the most central problem remained the same. There was no preserved scene in the usual sense. There was no clear body of physical evidence around which modern testing could build. This is an important distinction. A cold case does not become solvable merely because science improves. Science can only act on material that exists. If the central facts of a disappearance were always carried mainly by witnesses, then the case remains tied to witnesses even decades later. That does not make later review pointless. It makes its value different. The goal becomes refinement, elimination, and perhaps the strengthening of one scenario above others. Absolute proof may still remain out of reach. This helps explain why the Beaumont case has often been discussed in terms of structure rather than culprit. Why did it become so hard to solve? Why did so much effort fail to land on one answer? The reasons are cumulative: crowded public setting, children appearing untroubled, no immediate clear point of intervention, uncertain timelines, an unidentified adult whose appearance was ordinary, limited forensic pathways, large volumes of tips, repeated suspect theories with incomplete support. Each factor alone might be manageable. Together they are formidable. And then there is time. Time does not only fade memory, it changes physical landscapes. Shops close, buildings are altered. Properties change hands, road patterns shift, people move, witnesses die. A place once vivid in a detective's mind becomes a set of old photographs and municipal records. Later, investigators can stand in the same district and still not stand in the same environment. That matters. If a witness in 1966 said the children were near a certain corner, a later detective must understand not just the map, but how that corner functioned then. What was visible from where? Which shop was open? Where buses stopped? How people moved through the space. Cold case work often includes this kind of historical reconstruction. The Beaumont inquiry required a great deal of it, and even careful reconstruction has limits, because you are rebuilding a lived day from partial remains. In some later reviews, police and researchers tried to think more systematically about opportunity. Who could plausibly move through Glenelg without attracting notice? Who had enough composure to appear ordinary? Who had access to a vehicle or private space? Who could fit the witness descriptions without being too obviously memorable? Who had patterns of behavior elsewhere that might align? This kind of opportunity analysis can be helpful, but again, it can only narrow. Many men can, in theory, satisfy the same broad conditions. Without stronger physical evidence, opportunity remains suggestive. The Beaumont case became a long exercise in suggestive material. One can feel, in the repeated reopenings, the determination not to let that be the end of the story. Each new review was in part a refusal to accept that because the first years had failed, No further effort was justified. That persistence had institutional weight. Resources were allocated, searches authorized, files maintained, names revisited. Even if no answer emerged, the case was never treated as unworthy of answer. This matters ethically as much as practically. A cold case file is also a record of whether a society continues to care. South Australia did continue to care. So did many detectives who inherited the Beaumont matter long after the original summer day had passed into history. The file's persistence also created an unusual relationship between police work and public grief. In many cases, public attention fades before investigative interest does. Here, both endured together. Anniversaries, renewed discussion, documentaries and articles reintroduced old questions to new audiences. Former witnesses were sometimes sought again. Former suspects were reconsidered in print as well as in police review. This dual life of the case, official and cultural, made every new development more loaded. A search was not just a search. It became a public event. A suspect theory was not just a working line. It became a topic of national conversation. That can complicate police judgment. Not because officers do not know the difference, but because the atmosphere around a case influences expectations. The public wants progress to mean resolution. In reality, progress may simply mean more accurate uncertainty. That phrase sounds unsatisfying. Still, it is often the honest result of careful review. By the time the Beaumont case had passed through several generations of investigators, one lesson stood out more clearly than ever. This was not a file that lacked effort. It was a file that lacked a decisive foothold. The first day produced movement, but not capture. Later years produced theories, but not confirmation. Modern review produced renewed scrutiny, but not closure. And so the question slowly changed. Not only who did this, but why was this particular case so resistant? The answer begins with timing. In the first crucial hours, no one knew exactly when the day had turned. The children had not failed to arrive at home in some visibly impossible way. They had simply missed the expected return. That delay, ordinary at first glance, consumed precious time. By the moment police understood the seriousness, the key interactions of the afternoon were already over. Witnesses had dispersed. The crowd had thinned. The man, if there was one central man, was no longer there to be identified in place. This does not mean anyone responded negligently. It means the structure of the event gave the investigation a late start. The answer also lies in location. Glenelg was too open in a sense, and too busy. A quiet, isolated place might produce fewer witnesses, but stronger anomaly. A crowded public place produces more possible witnesses, but weaker focus. People remember fragments. No one believes the ordinary family scene or what looks like one is the scene that matters. By the time it matters, the fragments do not naturally join. Then there is demeanor. Several witness accounts suggested that the children appeared at ease. That single feature may have done more to cool the case than any other. If no one saw distress, no one intervened. If no one intervened, the critical transition from public safety to private danger, if that is what occurred, happened without interruption. And because it happened without interruption, the memory left behind was not sharp. It was gentle, almost. Children talking, children buying food, children near an adult. Nothing dramatic enough to be fixed forever in the minds of strangers. This is one of the saddest forms of investigative difficulty. Not chaos, but smoothness. The afternoon may have flowed too naturally for alarm. Another reason lies in the children themselves. There were 3 of them, and that creates a powerful assumption of safety. People imagine that 3 children together are less vulnerable than 1. They imagine the group has its own caution, its own collective sense. They may also assume that if one child were uneasy, the others would resist or attract attention. But group trust can work the other way. The eldest may reassure the younger. A younger child may follow because an older one does. An adult who wins the confidence of one child may, in effect, win the confidence of all 3. And to outsiders, 3 children with an adult may look more normal, not less. This is another way the case moved invisibly through daylight. The investigation also suffered from the broadness of the suspect pool. Because the unidentified man was described in ordinary terms, many people could fit. And because the witness descriptions emphasized calm rather than distinctiveness, police could not narrow rapidly. A case with a very unusual suspect feature can travel quickly through records and memory. A case with a common-looking adult in a common setting must sift through countless ordinary lives. That is laborious. It also invites false certainty, because when too many people fit, each promising one can seem more likely than he is. Police had to keep correcting for that. The repeated rise and fall of suspect theories is part of why the file feels so heavy, not because detectives were careless, but because reality offered many plausible shapes and no proof-rich one. You can see the same pattern in the matter of places searched. Searches were broad in the beginning because they had to be. Later searches were targeted because certain names or properties drew attention. But whether broad or narrow, most searches ended in the same practical result. Nothing conclusive. In public memory, this can make it seem as if the investigation moved from one dramatic site to another. Inside the file, however, each search represented a decision made under uncertainty. What is the threshold for acting? How much corroboration is enough? What if not searching leaves something undiscovered? What if searching produces nothing and weakens confidence again? These are difficult decisions, especially in a case that carries so much emotional weight. Through all of this, the Beaumont family endured a different kind of time. For police, years are measured in reviews, statements, and reopened lines. For family, years are measured in absence. Anniversary after anniversary, the case returned in public speech. That meant the family could never fully retreat from it. And because the case became so widely known, their private loss was repeatedly made public. This too affects how a cold case lives. It is not only a legal puzzle, it is a continuing human burden. When authorities chose to reopen old lines, they were not only testing evidence, they were also inevitably touching the family again. That is one reason investigators in old cases often speak carefully. Every new search raises hope. Hope, after many decades, can be hard to carry. And yet to stop searching entirely would mean something else, an acceptance that the file no longer deserves movement. The Beaumont case never reached that point. It remained open in fact and in feeling. As the years went on, another shift occurred. The case began to stand as an example of what Australian policing looked like before modern systems transformed investigative work. People studying the Beaumont disappearance often point to what was missing in 1966, not as blame, but as context. No widespread closed-circuit recording, no contemporary DNA methods attached to the central event. No simple national database that could instantly tie one suspicious name in Adelaide to conduct somewhere far away. No mobile records, no bank card trail, no easy chain of electronic traces following a person after he left the beach district. What remained instead was the older craft of investigation, and that craft, for all its care, had limits when the starting point was already uncertain. That is why, when people ask why the Beaumont case went cold, the answer is not one mistake or one missed chance, but a structure of difficulty. The structure began with a bright day, a public place, and children who did not appear frightened. It continued with witness accounts that were valuable but not stable enough to lock together cleanly. It hardened because the likely adult at the center of the case was described in a way that was too ordinary to isolate quickly. And it lasted because later reviews, however serious, inherited the same basic problem that the first investigators faced. Too many possibilities, too little proof. One detail in particular keeps returning when you lay the old statements side by side. It is the matter of timing, not dramatic timing, just ordinary household timing. The children were meant home in the early afternoon. That expectation created the first window of concern, but it was still a domestic window, not yet a police one. A child being late by a little while is one thing. 3 children being absent long enough for local searching to fail is something else. The difference between those two states is made of minutes. and of assumption. And in those minutes, the practical edge of the inquiry shifted outward. By the time officers were gathering statements, the beach crowd had changed. People had gone home. Heat had softened memory. The exact arrangement of faces around the kiosk, the bus stop, the dressing rooms, and Jetty Road had already begun to loosen. This was not anyone's fault. It was simply how time works in public space. You can imagine a witness being asked, later that day, whether they saw 3 children together. Perhaps they did. Perhaps they remember because there were 3 of them, and because one of them was very young. Then they are asked whether anyone was with them. Perhaps there was a man nearby. Perhaps he looked as though he belonged. Perhaps he was only noticed because the question itself suggested looking for a companion. This is the difficulty. The statement may still contain truth, but how much truth, and which part of it, becomes harder to know with every retelling. That is one reason police in later years kept circling back to the earliest statements. The nearer a statement was to the event, the less chance there was for news coverage and public talk to alter it. Yet early statements have their own weaknesses. People have not had time to reflect. They are often unsure what mattered. They omit things that feel trivial. They estimate rather than know. So there is no perfect statement in a case like this. Only statements that are a little stronger, or a little less shaped by what came later. Another practical problem was the way the known details seemed to point in one direction without becoming a single line. The £1 note suggested an unexplained source of money. The unknown man suggested companionship. The missed bus suggested a break in routine. The crowded setting suggested that whatever happened did not look alarming. Together those details lean toward one broad interpretation. But broad interpretations do not solve cases. They only tell police where to spend time. And a case becomes cold, very often, at the point where a broad interpretation cannot be turned into one prosecutable account. This is where the Beaumont file sat for decades. It had shape. It did not have closure. There is another quieter reason the case resisted solution. Investigators had to decide, over and over, how much trust to place in witness memory. If they leaned too heavily on memory, they risked building around error. If they discounted memory too much, they risked discarding the only narrative thread available. That is a very narrow path to walk. In a case with little forensic grounding, witnesses are both fragile and essential. You cannot solve the case without them. You also cannot assume they are exact. So each later review became a kind of balancing act. Which account is independent? Which account was given before publicity intensified? Which witness had a reason to be attentive? Which details are repeated by different people without obvious contamination? This sounds almost clerical when put plainly. Still, it is at the heart of why the case remained open, because no one memory could bear the full weight. Police were left trying to braid many partial memories into something stronger. Sometimes the braid held for a while. Then a contradiction would appear. A time would not fit. A description would drift. A suspect would not quite match. And the whole thing would loosen again. In that sense, the Beaumont case did not go cold all at once. It cooled in stages. First, there was urgent searching, then active interviewing, then widening enquiry and elimination, then the storage of unresolved leads, then the periodic return of hope when a new suspect, a new site, or a new method seemed to offer leverage. And after each return, the same truth remained. The case had never lacked seriousness. It had lacked a fixed point strong enough to survive scrutiny. The role of the unknown man is central to this explanation. If he was indeed the person last meaningfully associated with the children, then his unidentified status became the whole around which the whole file formed. If he had been named within hours, the case might have followed one road. If he had been recognized from the public descriptions, the case might have moved differently. If his appearance had been unusual, or if he had used a distinctive vehicle, or if several witnesses had described him in sharply consistent terms, police would have had a firmer access. Instead, they had a man who looked as many men looked on a beach day in January. That ordinariness was not incidental. It was one of the case's main defenses against solution. Then there is Geography. Glenelg was not an isolated patch of sand cut off from the city. It was connected, lively, full of movement, and easily entered and left. A person could arrive, spend part of the day there, and depart without attracting much attention. If the unknown adult was local, one might expect eventual recognition. If he was not local, then the witness descriptions had to carry the burden much farther. That turned one unresolved identity into a regional and potentially wider problem. Police had to think not only about the beach, but about roads away from it, rail and bus movement, temporary lodgings, work sites, boarding houses, and all the practical routes by which a person might pass through Adelaide. The broader the geography, the slower the checking. And the slower the checking, the more time for memory to fade and for promising lines to cool. One of the hardest things for any investigation is the absence of interruption. If a key event is broken by a witness speaking up, or by some obstacle, or by a detail that forces itself into many memories, the file has something solid to return to. In the Beaumont case, the likely decisive moment appears to have passed without that interruption. No one stepped in. No one noted a license number that held. No one could later say with full certainty, at this exact point, this adult took those children in that direction. There were impressions, there were sightings, there was concern afterward, but there was no single public hinge. That made the case unusually vulnerable to the wear of time. The later searches, including excavations and site reviews, show how much police and others wanted to compensate for that missing hinge. If the decisive human moment could not be recovered, perhaps a place might speak, perhaps an old property linked to a suspicious man, perhaps a patch of ground under concrete, perhaps something overlooked in the first years. This was never irrational. It was the natural movement of a case trying to convert suspicion into evidence. But the repeated failure of those searches also taught something important. The case was not merely waiting for one buried object. Its difficulty was baked into the original circumstances. That is why even ambitious later action could not guarantee progress. You can also see why public pressure, though understandable, sometimes pushed against the logic of the evidence. A famous unresolved case creates a hunger for an answer with a face attached to it. A named suspect gives shape to grief. It can feel almost like relief to say, perhaps it was this man, perhaps that property, perhaps this theory long whispered around Adelaide. But police could not responsibly stop at perhaps. They had to ask whether the witness evidence really pointed there, whether the person could truly be placed in the right time and place, whether independent facts supported the suspicion. Often the answer was no, or not enough. That repeated refusal to settle for a weak resolution is part of why the case remained unresolved, but it is also part of why the investigation retained integrity. Not every unsolved case is unsolved because too little was done. Some are unsolved because too little could be firmly proved. The Beaumont file belongs in that category. And yet there is still one more part of why it went cold, and it has to do with the kind of disappearance this was. 3 children, together, in daylight, in a public leisure setting. That combination invites assumptions that work against urgency in the first moments. 3 children together seems safer than one alone. Daylight seems safer than night. A crowded beach seems safer than a quiet road. An adult who appears relaxed and accepted by the children seems safer than one who draws attention. Each assumption is understandable. All of them, together, create a setting in which bystanders are less likely to feel that intervention is needed. If the crucial minutes were built out of those assumptions, then the case's later coldness began right there, in the ordinary confidence of the scene. For later detectives, understanding this was important. It meant the case was not simply about finding a missing suspect. It was about understanding why the disappearance had left so soft an impression on the public space around it. Why had no one fixed the right image in memory? Why had the day yielded fragments rather than a sequence? Why did so many people seem to have seen something, and yet no one see enough? The answer, again, is that nothing may have looked wrong until it was far too late. That is a difficult kind of truth to work with. It leaves almost no drama in the immediate record. Only afterthought. Only reconstruction. only the patient arrangement of small remembered things. There is a temptation, in a case this old, to believe that modern methods must eventually force certainty out of the archive. But patience sometimes teaches the opposite lesson. Modern review can clarify why a case is hard without making it easy. It can sharpen the categories of evidence. It can show which witness statements were probably stronger than others. It can eliminate some myths. It can revisit suspects with more disciplined skepticism. Still, if the central event produced little enduring physical evidence and no confirmed, identifiable final encounter, then even a very modern review may end where the original case ended, with a narrowed field and no conclusion. That is not failure in the dramatic sense. It is the edge of what evidence allows. And so, by the time the Beaumont case had entered its long middle age, it stood as a kind of map of investigative limits, not limits of concern, not limits of effort, limits of what can be recovered once an ordinary-looking event passes unchallenged through a crowded day. This is also where the case begins to reach beyond police work and into the lives around it, because a case that stays open for decades does not remain only a file. It becomes part of the family's weather, part of the city's memory, part of the way a shoreline is imagined. The children disappeared on a summer holiday in a place made for leisure. That fact alone changed how many Australians thought about public safety, childhood freedom, and the trust once placed in ordinary spaces. Before this case, many families in Australia and elsewhere accepted a certain looseness around children's movements. A short bus trip to the beach, a few hours out with siblings, coins in a pocket, a time to be home. The arrangement relied on familiarity. It relied on the idea that a child moving through known places would be held loosely by the safety of the crowd. After the Beaumont disappearance, that arrangement did not look the same. The case did not create all parental caution, of course, but it became one of the events that gave caution a new shape. People spoke differently about where children could go, how long they should be away, whether younger siblings should follow older ones without an adult, whether public places were as naturally protective as they seemed. This is one reason the case still feels so present in Australian memory. It did not just remain unsolved. It altered behaviour. Glenelg itself became part of that altered feeling. For anyone who knew the beach, the disappearance attached an absence to a familiar landscape. Jetty Road was still Jetty Road. The kiosks, shops, bus areas and stretches of sand remained ordinary in their own way. And yet, after 1966, they also carried a second life in memory, not as sinister places exactly, more as places where the ordinary had once failed to protect. That distinction matters. The case did not turn Glenelg into something dark. It turned it into something tender in the public imagination, a place where sunlight and uncertainty now lived side by side. For the Beaumont family, the passage of time had a different texture. Public memory made the case visible, private life made the loss continuous. Nancy and Jim Beaumont were asked, again and again over the years, to revisit the same afternoon. Each anniversary brought new articles, new broadcasts, new questions. Each major lead brought fresh attention. Each new theory required some degree of response, or at least endurance. This is one of the quiet cruelties of a famous unsolved case. The family does not merely live with not knowing. They live with the repeated public rehearsal of not knowing. And because the children had become so widely recognized, the family could not retreat into obscurity even if they wanted to. The names Jane, Anna, and Grant belonged not only to them, but to the country's unresolved memory. That public ownership is complicated. It means people care. It also means grief is never entirely private. Over the decades, the Beaumont parents continued to appeal for information and continued to live inside uncertainty that never aged into certainty. There is a special patience in that, not the patience of detectives reviewing files, another kind, the patience of waking up year after year with the same unanswered question, and still allowing the world to ask you about it. In cold cases, people sometimes speak of closure as though it were a door that might simply shut if the right fact is found. Real life is softer than that. Even solved cases do not restore what was lost, and in unsolved ones, the absence remains active. Still, an answer matters. It matters because uncertainty has no natural end. The Beaumont family lived within that fact for the rest of their lives, and the city, in a lesser but still real way, lived within it too. Anniversaries became markers not just of time past, but of collective endurance. Each year said the same thing quietly: we still do not know. That sentence can change a community. The case also shaped how police and journalists in Australia thought about missing children. It became an example returned to again and again whenever public warnings, missing persons procedures, and child safety debates were discussed, not always directly, sometimes only as background. A memory under the surface, a reminder that a crowd is not the same as security, and that the appearance of calm can conceal a pivotal moment. This influence is hard to measure neatly. It lives in culture more than in statistics, but it is there. The Beaumont case became one of those old stories that adults carried when they made decisions for children, not because they wanted to frighten, but because they remembered, and remembering changed habits. There is also the question of how a city keeps a file alive after so much time. Part of the answer is institutional. Police did not close the case and set it aside as irrelevant. They continued at intervals to review it, to test old assumptions, to assess new information, to authorize searches when the evidentiary threshold seemed to justify them. That continuing institutional attention matters. It tells you something about the moral weight the case retained. South Australia did not treat the disappearance as merely historical. It remained present tense, in the sense that the file was still open and the possibility of new information was still taken seriously. Part of the answer is social. People kept talking. Writers revisited the timeline. Former witnesses came forward, or were sought again. Suspect theories rose and fell. Documentaries returned to Glenelg and to the old photographs. The story did not go quiet, because too many people felt it should not. This social persistence can sometimes distort a case. Yes, but it can also preserve it from neglect. And neglect is one of the great dangers in long unsolved investigations. A file that no one reads eventually becomes only paper. The Beaumont file remained read. Even when answers did not come, attention did. The danger, of course, is that attention can become certainty where no certainty exists. This is especially true around suspects who fit the emotional need for a culprit. Over the years, particular names attracted broad suspicion. Harry Phipps was one. Other men at different times also drew heavy interest. Some had troubling histories, some had access to property, some seemed in broad outline to match the unknown man. Some had rumors attached to them that were impossible to ignore, and yet the same discipline always had to reassert itself. Interest is not proof, suspicion is not proof, a property search is not proof. A witness who thinks many years later that a man resembles the remembered figure is not proof. The file kept teaching that lesson even when the public did not want to hear it. That is one reason the case has such a peculiar, emotional texture. It invites conviction. It refuses resolution. If you return to the beginning often enough, you begin to see how little would have needed to be different for the whole investigation to change. One stronger identification, one preserved physical link, one truly distinctive vehicle, one witness who had reason to study the man carefully and did so before publicity spread. One interruption in the smoothness of the afternoon. Any of these might have given the file a center. Without them, police were left with a case made mostly of adjacency. The children near the beach, the children near the bakery, the children perhaps near the bus area, the children with a man, the £1 note, the missed return. All of it close to the truth, perhaps. None of it enough to hold the truth still. That is why the case became emblematic. Not simply tragic, though it was that. Emblematic of a type of old mystery in which context is abundant and conclusion is absent. Investigators could describe the world of the case with increasing precision. They could explain the rhythms of Glenelg that day, The family routine, the witness landscape, the suspect theories, the later searches. What they could not do was move from explanation to certainty. This is harder for the public to accept than total obscurity. If nothing were known, then perhaps it would feel simpler. But too much is known for simplicity, and too little for closure. That middle state is where cold cases live. There is something else as well. Time softens language. In the beginning, a case is spoken about in practical terms: missing children, search areas, witnesses. Then, as decades pass, the language becomes almost archival. The Beaumont children, the Glenelg timeline, the unknown man, the North Plimpton excavation. The phrases settle into public speech and begin to sound familiar. That familiarity can hide the rawness underneath. 3 children left home for the beach and did not come back. When you say it plainly, without the history around it, the simplicity is still startling. Perhaps that is why the case has endured so strongly. Its mystery is complex, but its beginning is so ordinary. The file has outlived many of the people who first carried it. Witnesses aged, investigators retired, journalists changed, and yet the shoreline remained. People still walked the esplanade. Children still asked for coins, for bus fare, for time at the water. Shops still opened. Bakers still lifted trays in the morning. The tram still came and went. That is one of the strange things about a case like this. A city absorbs it, but does not stop. Life keeps moving around the absence. When later detectives reopened the file, they were not only reviewing witness statements and suspect lists, they were also reviewing a vanished version of Adelaide. That mattered more than it might seem. A bus stop in 1966 was not only a point on a map, it was a social space. A place where people waited differently, watched differently, expected different things from strangers and from children. A beachside shopping strip was not only a line of businesses, it was a rhythm of the day. Who was there before lunch? Who stepped out after church? Which counters were busiest at midday? Which workers would have noticed children buying food and which would have served them without a second thought? Cold case work often asks for this kind of patience. You have to reconstruct not only movement, but normality. Because if you do not know what normal looked like, you cannot tell where the case drifted away from it. In the Beaumont matter, that drift was always slight. That was the problem. The day did not rupture. It slid. One ordinary sighting became another. One harmless errand became a final trace. And each later review returned to the same difficult question. At what point, exactly, did the afternoon stop belonging to the children and begin belonging to the unknown adult, if there was one? No one could answer that with certainty, but investigators could study the edges. They could look again at the sequence around the beach. They could look again at the bakery purchase. They could look again at the missed return home. And in doing so, they kept seeing how little resistance the event had met from the world around it. That is part of the reason the case settled so deeply into public memory. It asked people to accept that a bright day, a public place, and the company of others were not always enough. As the years passed, the file acquired a second life in archives and interviews. Reporters revisited old neighborhoods. Former police officers were asked what they remembered. Researchers examined newspaper coverage from the first days and compared it with the formal record. This kind of work does not solve a case by itself. Still, it can expose where public memory and police memory begin to separate. Sometimes a detail repeated for decades turns out to have been less firm than people believed. Sometimes a small fact buried in an early report turns out to be stronger than later summaries suggest. The Beaumont case was full of both kinds of rediscovery. One reason the unknown man remained so central was that he linked several otherwise scattered details. If the children were with him near the beach, and if Jane used money she was not thought to have carried, then adult contact likely mattered early, not late. If that was true, then the case had to be understood less as a sudden interruption and more as a gradual gaining of trust. That idea was never comfortable. But it fit the witness pattern more closely than any public scene of alarm. It also explained why bystanders did not act. A man speaking gently, offering food, walking with three children who seemed calm. None of that demands intervention in the moment. Only later does it become unbearable. Police, in later decades, kept testing whether this reading still held, and mostly the structure remained. Not because every witness was dependable in every detail, but because the broad shape of the accounts did not easily collapse into some simpler explanation. The children did not seem simply lost. They did not seem to be wandering in confusion. They seemed, in several accounts, to be moving with purpose. That purpose may not have been their own. Once that possibility is accepted, the whole day looks different. The £1 note becomes more significant. The easy public movement becomes more significant. The absence of distress becomes more significant. And the failure to identify the adult becomes, in hindsight, the great investigative wound in the case. There were also practical reasons later searches and reviews never produced the clean breakthrough people hoped for. Physical places change too much. A factory yard in one decade becomes a redevelopment site in another. A house linked to a suspect is altered, sold, demolished, or built over. A patch of land that once seemed accessible becomes difficult to read historically. Even when investigators do excavate, they are often working against many layers of alteration. The North Plimpton searchers made this plain. The decision to dig came from sustained concern and accumulated suspicion. It was not casual, but the absence of decisive findings did not tell detectives that the original suspicions were foolish. It told them something narrower and more sobering. Even a site with years of rumor and attention may no longer be able to answer for the past. That is one reason cold case work so often returns to paperwork. The ground changes. The archive, at least in part, remains. And the Beaumont archive remained dense, not neat. Dense. Thousands of pages and many decades of interpretation. That kind of archive creates its own danger. A new investigator can be overwhelmed by volume and seduced by coherence. When you read enough old reports, enough witness statements, enough newspaper stories, one theory can begin to feel inevitable simply because it has been repeated so often. Good cold casework resists that. It asks which theory survives independent scrutiny, which facts stand without borrowing strength from rumor, which witness accounts were early enough and separate enough to matter on their own. And in the Beaumont file, that discipline kept dragging the investigation back towards uncertainty. Not because nothing was known, because what was known could not be made final. That distinction shaped the whole life of the case. By this stage, the case was not only a police matter or a family grief, it had become part of how Australia talked about childhood. Before 1966, many parents accepted a wider perimeter of freedom. Children walked farther, caught transport alone more often, spent unstructured hours in public places. This was not negligence. It was the social arrangement of the time. The Beaumont disappearance did not create the end of that arrangement on its own, but it became one of the events that clearly narrowed it. Afterward, the same acts could not be seen with the same ease. A child on a bus no longer looked only independent. A beach outing no longer looked only harmless. A public crowd no longer guaranteed comfort. That change was slow, but real. It moved through family conversations, school routines, and the little decisions parents make without announcing them. Wait for me, come straight home, stay together, tell me exactly where you're going. These are ordinary sentences, but cases like this can give them new force. The Beaumont children became part of that change without ever choosing it. Their names entered a national caution, and because the case was never solved, the caution never softened into a finished lesson. It remained open, like the file itself. There is a tendency, when discussing famous unsolved cases, to make them symbols first and human stories second. This case resists that if you stay close to the family. Jim and Nancy Beaumont were not living inside a national parable. They were living in a house that had once held three children's routines: breakfasts, bathing things drying after the beach, school habits, voices in ordinary rooms. After the disappearance, every later public development passed back through that private silence. A renewed search was not only a procedural event, it was another moment in which hope and dread had to be carried together. A new suspect theory was not only a story for newspapers, it was another request, direct or indirect, for the family to imagine a possible answer. And because so many of those theories failed to conclude, the case asked something exhausting of them. Remain available to hope, but never trust it fully. That is a hard discipline. You can feel it in the history of the case. Each reopening matters. Each reopening also risks another fall. Still, they did not turn away from appeals. That persistence gave the investigation a moral center. Even in old age, even through decades of uncertainty, the family's presence reminded the public that this was not an abstract puzzle. It was an unfinished absence. For police, too, the file carried an unusual kind of inheritance. A detective joining the review decades later did not inherit only a set of facts. He inherited the weight of earlier effort, the long search, the failed leads, the national scrutiny, the sense that many good people had already tried and had not reached the end. That can shape the psychology of an investigation. Some files invite boldness, others invite caution. The Beaumont file demanded both. Boldness to reopen old ground, to authorize expensive searches, to test long-standing assumptions. Caution to avoid mistaking movement for proof. This balance is difficult in any cold case. In one this famous, it becomes harder, because every public act carries symbolic force. A search means more than a search. A suspect review means more than a review. A forensic re-examination means more than a technical step. Each one says perhaps the long waiting has shifted, and when it has not, the silence afterward is felt widely. That rhythm of hope and disappointment became part of the case's public life. It also helps explain why some people came to attach strongly to particular suspects. A named figure offers emotional stability. He gives shape to years of uncertainty. He makes the file feel narratable. The trouble is that narratable is not the same as true. Investigators had to keep holding that line. The public may prefer one story, evidence may refuse it. The Beaumont case taught that lesson repeatedly. If you look at the whole history patiently, one thing becomes clear. The case remained open, not because there were no ideas, but because there were too many that could not be settled. One line pointed toward a local man with access to property, another toward an unidentified beach companion, another toward the possibility of a traveler or transient figure, another toward a person who had approached the children gradually and left little impression on anyone else. Each had some logic. None acquired enough force to close the others down. That is the coldness at the center of the file. Not emptiness, competition, several possible shapes, all incomplete. This is why the case has remained so instructive to later investigators. It shows what happens when witness evidence is abundant but unstable, when public attention is high but physical proof is scarce, when a likely suspect figure exists but never hardens into one person who can be firmly named, when later searches generate action but not finality. In that sense, the Beaumont case is not simply unsolved. It is almost a study in the anatomy of unresolved evidence. That is a dry phrase, perhaps. But behind it is a very human reality. 3 children left home for a familiar outing. The world around them appeared ordinary enough not to intervene. And afterward, every effort to reconstruct the day ran into the same soft edges. The city continued carrying those edges in small ways. Anniversary coverage returned to old photographs. People who had lived through the summer of 1966 described exactly where they were when they first heard. New generations, born long after, learned the names almost as part of local history. There are cases that live in official memory. There are others that live in family memory. The Beaumont disappearance lived in both and also in civic memory. It became one of the stories Adelaide told about itself, not proudly, but carefully. A reminder that a familiar place can hold one unanswered day for a very long time. Glenelg itself remained active, bright, loved. That matters too. The case did not empty the beach of life. It simply changed the emotional texture of the place for those who knew the story. A parent watching children near the water might think briefly of the Beaumonts. Someone passing the shops might remember the bakery purchase. Someone waiting near transport might recall the missed bus and the simple domestic expectation attached to it. Be home by this time. That line still echoes through the case. Perhaps because it is so ordinary. No warning in it, no fear. Just trust, measured in afternoon hours. That may be why the case still feels close, even after all the decades. It begins in the language of ordinary family life. And still, the official work did not entirely stop. Cold case reviews continued to ask whether preserved materials, however slight, might yield something more. Whether older witness groupings should be reassessed. Whether names once set aside for lack of corroboration might deserve another look under changed standards. Whether public appeals, framed differently, might prompt one more useful recollection from someone who had long stayed silent. This is the patient side of investigation that often goes unseen. Not the dramatic search alone, but the willingness to keep reading, checking, and rechecking after the world has mostly moved on. South Australian police did that with this file. So did journalists and researchers in their own different ways. Sometimes these efforts overlapped. Sometimes they conflicted. Sometimes outside inquiry generated noise. Sometimes it generated a lead worth considering. That tension belongs to many famous cold cases. The official archive and the public archive grow side by side. One is governed by evidentiary standards, the other by memory, rumor, grief, and the human need to make a story complete. The Beaumont case never fully escaped that tension. Perhaps no case like it ever could. Still, the official record remained what it had long been, unresolved but active enough to review. That may sound modest. In a case this old, modest persistence matters. It is the difference between abandonment and care. There is another quiet truth inside the file. As years pass, the hope for a complete answer changes shape. At first, the hope is immediate. Find the children, identify the man, trace the route. Then, after years, the hope becomes narrower. Clarify the timeline, eliminate the wrong suspect. Understand one more piece of the afternoon, locate one site worth revisiting. By the time decades have passed, even those narrower hopes can matter, because each one reduces the field of uncertainty a little. And in a case built from uncertainty, little reductions are still meaningful. The Beaumont reviews across later decades often worked at exactly that scale. Not grand revelation, incremental refinement. This witness likely stronger than that one. This property likely less relevant than once believed. This suspect still interesting but still unsupported. This search justified but inconclusive. That kind of progress is hard to dramatize. It is easier to overlook, yet it may be the truest form of respect a cold case receives. Not false certainty, not theatrical confidence, just patient refusal to stop thinking carefully. If you sit with the file long enough, one final complexity starts to stand out. The case changed because the world changed around it. Methods improved, public expectations changed, journalistic styles changed, ideas about child safety changed. Even the language used to discuss witness reliability became more precise. That means the Beaumont case has been interpreted through several eras at once. The original investigation belonged to the mid-1960s. The first major waves of theory belonged to later decades with different assumptions. The renewed searches belong to an age more comfortable with forensic hope and historical excavation. Each era brought new tools, but also new lenses, and each lens slightly altered what seemed important. In one decade, a suspect's social standing might influence how attention gathered around him. In another, that same status might be read differently. In one period, witness confidence might be treated as especially persuasive. In another, confidence might be viewed more skeptically. In one period, the public might tolerate unresolved ambiguity. In another, there might be stronger appetite for naming a likely culprit even without charges. The Beaumont file, passed through all of these climates. That is why later investigators had to do more than review facts. They had to review how the facts had been read. This is subtle work. You are asking not only what the witness said, but how earlier detectives understood what the witness said. Not only why a suspect was considered, but why he became compelling in that particular era. Not only why a search was authorized, but what assumptions about risk, proof, and possibility made that authorization seem wise at the time. Such work can make a case feel quieter rather than louder. It strips away the confidence of easy retellings. It leaves you with a harder, truer thing. A mystery that has been worked on honestly, repeatedly, and still resists. That resistance is part of why the file remains unfinished, not only on paper, but in feeling. People still ask whether one more witness might come forward, whether one preserved detail, overlooked in an old report, might align with some later record, whether some person who was young then, old now, might finally connect a name to the fair-haired figure described near the beach. These are not impossible hopes. Cold cases do sometimes turn on one late act of memory, one stored object, one relationship newly spoken aloud. But the Beaumont case also teaches caution about hope. The same long life that preserves possibility also preserves disappointment. For every promising line, there has so often been a reason to step back. This witness heard too much from the newspapers. This statement came too late. This suspect fits broadly but not closely enough. This site produced nothing conclusive. This memory cannot be verified. Again and again the file narrows without closing. That is why it still feels unfinished in a very particular way. Not neglected, not forgotten, simply unresolved. And so the story keeps circling the same modest objects. A bus ride, a beach towel, a bakery counter, a pound note, a man standing easily in public view, a family waiting through the afternoon for children who should already have been home. These details are small enough to feel domestic. Perhaps that is why they endure. The case does not depend on one grand piece of evidence. It depends on ordinary things that never stopped mattering. A child buying lunch, a witness noticing but not memorizing, a parent checking the time once, then again. A city learning too late that a routine day had shifted into history. All of that remains in the file. All of it remains in the public memory around the file. And because it remains, the case is still not still. People continue to turn it over gently, looking for some overlooked line of force that might finally hold. In later reviews, this produced a quieter style of thinking. Less confidence in single suspects. More attention to structure. Why were the children apparently comfortable? How much weight should be given to the food purchase? Could the most important contact have occurred earlier than the final witness sightings suggest? Was the unknown man truly one man in the statements? Or several ordinary adults blurred into one composite figure by later retelling? That last question mattered a great deal. If the witnesses were describing one person, then the case had a missing center. If they were describing more than one harmless person, then investigators risked building around a figure who never existed in the clean way public memory imagined him. Cold case reviewers had to ask this without losing the broad insight the witnesses may still have been offering. Again, the path was narrow. Reject too much, and the narrative dissolves. Accept too much, and it hardens falsely. This is one of the deepest reasons the case resisted solution. Its evidence was never empty, but it was always vulnerable to the way human beings make patterns after loss. The patient investigator has to live with that vulnerability, has to read the file and still keep asking where memory ends and meaning begins. And somewhere in that patient rereading, the focus naturally returns to the family, because every procedural question eventually does. If the timeline shifts by half an hour, what changes? If the unknown man was first seen earlier than thought, what changes? If a suspect linked to a property cannot be proved present at Glenelg, what changes? In each case, the answer is the same. In one sense,